In my weakness, you are strong. You ever felt weak and you're like, I don't know if I can go through with this? Honestly, it's a little bit how I feel right now. I'm up here coughing. I'm like, oh, come on, not now, not now. Here comes the throat issue again. And God just reminds us, hey, I'm perfect. In all my ways, I'm perfect. And in your weakness, I'm strong. You ever been in a situation where somebody asked you to do something, but you just didn't feel capable of doing it? Anybody? Like 4 people? Because the rest of you, I'm going to ask you to do some pretty hard things. And you're like, oh, well, you said you were fine, right? You've never faced that. You've never experienced that before. Yeah, I mean, those situations where you feel like, I know this is something somebody's asking me to do. I just don't feel capable of doing it. And, maybe somebody asked you to teach a class, or maybe to lead a team, or to build something, or to fix something. And you're like, I just don't know if I can. I don't know if I can do it. Maybe you lack the physical strength to do whatever it was that somebody asked you to do, and you're just like, I don't think I can do that. Perhaps you lacked the education or the experience to do something, that you lacked the training and the know-how to get something done, and you're like, I don't know if I can do it. And in that moment, you probably thought to yourself, yeah, that's something that somebody should do. Yep. What you're saying, somebody ought to do that. It's something that needs to be done, but I just don't think that I'm capable of doing it. That's a great job for somebody else. After all, I mean, what if I fail? What if I mess up? What if things don't go well? What if I'm not up for the task? What if? And we've got all of these what ifs that sometimes keep us from doing the things that God has called us to do. You ever felt like that? That was me, well, on multiple occasions, but one time I can think specifically, that was me 8 years ago. 8 years ago, right before the presidential election, right before we voted on our next president, I was also being voted on to make a transition from youth pastor, which I had done here for 8 years, to lead pastor. That was 8 years ago. 8 years ago, I had some reservations about making that transition. I mean, after all, what if they vote no? Can I even stay here? I mean, I had some inadequacies. I had some concerns about even applying for that position. In fact, probably most of you don't know this, and since that was 8 years ago, I can share this. I tried to convince 2 other people to apply for the position. I said, I think you'd be great at this. I sat down with them. I had lunch with them. I said, I think that you would be great for this position. And I went on, and I told them a little bit about our church, where we had been in the past, our recent history. I told them a little bit about some of the things that we were doing. I told them, hey, and this is the direction that we're headed, and kind of where we're going. And both of them looked at me and said, you seem pretty passionate about your church. Why don't you apply for it? And I'm like, and I gave him some weak excuses. And I'm like, well, they need somebody else. I'm too young. At the time, I was 32 years old. I'm too young. I'm not experienced enough. I'm not qualified. My biggest one was, I don't think that they'll follow my leadership. Ironically, the passage that we're going to look at today is the passage that I preached when I was candidating for this position 8 years ago. Not to the date, but right around the same time. And we're going to look at a reluctant leader, somebody that's like, I don't think I'm qualified to do this. I don't think I can pull this off. Some of you are wondering, how did the vote go? I mentioned it was 8 years ago? Okay. Yeah, they fired me. I said, I'm not leaving. No, I'm just kidding. Sometimes, and I think perhaps most of the time, God uses us when we feel least prepared to be used. When we feel least qualified to be used by God is the time that God uses us most. it's a little bit interesting because, I mean, we're in this series talking about epic battles, and we're looking at these heroic battles and these heroic leaders and these things that these incredible people did, and we read their stories, and we get together, 2,000, 3,000 years later, 4,000 years later, and we're still telling these stories about these men and women who did these incredible things. And I got to be honest, there are times where you read through the pages of Scripture and you're like, that's amazing. And that's amazing that God used those people. Right? That God did something amazing through them. And in fact, it's in those moments that we begin to believe a lie. And the lie goes something like this, that God only uses incredibly strong people to do great things. That's the lie we believe, that God only uses incredibly strong people to do great things. It's a lie. But it's one that we believe. So far in this series, we've spent all of our time focused on Joshua, who's an incredible leader. He's a leader of the nation of Israel. In fact, one of the last verses of the book of Joshua says that Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua. I mean, that's pretty awesome, right? He must have been an incredible leader. And of course, Joshua was the successor of Moses. He was also a pretty competent leader of the nation of Israel, right? Pretty impressive guy. We're going to look at King David later on in this series, and the thing about King David is, well, he's a king. That's got to count for something, right? So what about the rest of us? What about the rest of us non-kingly people? What about the rest of us who aren't leaders of entire nations? Can God use us to do great things, or is that only for the strong? Can God use those of us who are weak and insecure to do great things for Him? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And while you probably know the ending, or maybe you know the answer to that question ultimately, the question is, do we really believe that? And perhaps more importantly, how does that affect the way that we live every day? So if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. If you're using one of our Bibles, that's page 194. 194, we'll put up on the screen as well. And before we get started, we're going to look at a map. There's going to be a map here. So it just kind of tells us a little bit about the background as to where does this take place. And we've tried to have this map so that you can see that these are real places. And so far we've looked at, a little bit through Israel, and most of the stories we've looked at were in the southern part of Israel. But today we're going to focus more on the northern side of Israel and some of the things that took place there. Some of the places you're going to see on the map, right up here on the top right, that's the Sea of Galilee. That's where Jesus spent most of his time. Over on the top left, you see Mount Carmel. And that's pretty awesome. Rita and I had a chance, and Andy swore out to stand on that mountain and look across the Jezreel Valley where the Battle of Armageddon is going to take place. And actually from that spot, Mount Carmel, you can see this hill called the Hill of Morah. And that is where this takes place. This is where that all takes place. This is a real place. So with this in mind, with where that takes place in that valley, the Bible tells us that they were camped out in that valley, or in a valley at the foot of the hill of Morah. With that in mind, let's see what happens in this epic battle of the Bible. Now, just to kind of mix things up a bit, I've asked Jay Tompkins. Everybody say hi to Jay. Hey, Jay. Jay is going to be our narrator today. I've asked Jay if he could read through some of these passages, and then I'm going to unpack them a little bit. So we're going to look at, first of all, Judges chapter 6, verses 1 through 11.
The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in the mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops, all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all of your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me."
All right, so that's a little bit about the background. Kind of the setting of the story. Joshua and the Israelites, they've conquered the land. Okay, so the land is theirs. They're living in the land. They're living in the promised land that God had promised to give them. So they're living there, but they still have enemies. There's still other people around that apparently they also want this land, right? And so they still have these enemies. And Joshua is long gone. He has died, and unfortunately, after his death, the people of Israel, they went through periods of rebellion against God. Remember, I mentioned that when Joshua was still their leader, they served God the whole time. But now Joshua is gone, and then they go through these periods of rebellion. And this is kind of the book of Judges. It is kind of tells us a little bit about the history of Israel and how they would go through this cycle of sin. In fact, this cycle of sin and rebellion, it looks something like this. You know, for a while, Israel serves the Lord. And then Israel falls into sin and idolatry. After that, Israel is oppressed. They're enslaved. After that, Israel cries out to God. And then God raises up a judge, somebody like usually a military type leader, somebody that brings some kind of deliverance. People like Gideon and Ehud and Samson and Deborah, you know, some of those Bible names. And then Israel is delivered. And then Israel serves the Lord. And then they sin. And then they're oppressed. And then they cry out, and then God provides them a judge, and then they're delivered, and then they serve God, and then it's just this vicious cycle where they do good, they fail, there's a consequence, they cry out. By the way, does that sound familiar? You know, before we're like, man, Israel, I can't believe that they would do something like that. Wait a minute. Kind of sounds a lot like us, right? I mean, we do good for a while, then we fail, and then we're like, and then we have some kind of consequence, and then we cry out to God, and God brings some deliverance. You know, He forgives us of our sin, we serve God, and then we're doing good, and then we fail, and you know, so that's kind of the cycle of this entire nation. And God keeps bringing these oppressors, like Midian, to cause them to repent and to cause them to change their ways. We mentioned a couple weeks ago where there's sin in the camp, God can't bless, right? And that was what was going on in the time of the judges. There was sin in the camp, and God's like, I can't bless that. We need to get rid of that. And so here Israel is. They're being oppressed by the Midianites, and they're everywhere. The text tells us it was impossible to count them. There's so many that you can't even count them. And Israel is living in fear, and they're hiding. They're hiding from the Midianites. They're hiding from this enormous, overwhelming army that's on their doorstep. So that's kind of a little bit about the context. So let's see what happens next. Judges 6:11.
The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive."
All right. So the first thing I want you to remember, if you have notes, this will be helpful. The first thing is this, that God chooses those who are weak. God chooses those who are weak. And that's a little counterintuitive to us, because when we're picking teams, we try to look for the strongest people that we can find. Anybody remember gym class? Wouldn't it have been nice to teach that lesson to some people? No, well, listen, God chooses those who are weak, so I think you should pick me first. That doesn't work in gym class, right? But God operates on a different system, and God chooses those who are weak. And when God calls Gideon to this incredible task, Gideon is hiding like everybody else. That's what he's doing. He's hiding. In fact, Gideon's goal is just to save the food from the Midianites, right? We need to save the food. We need to protect the food. We need to save the food from the Midianites, not save an entire nation. That's what God calls him to. Gideon certainly didn't feel qualified for the position. And it's interesting that when the angel of the Lord first meets Gideon, he says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Yes, mighty warrior. You who's like watching all this food, and you're trying to keep it from the Midianites. You're the mighty warrior. Was Gideon a mighty warrior? I'd have to say, not yet. Not yet. He says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Verse 13 says, "Pardon me, Lord." Excuse me, God, you've got the wrong guy. Pardon me. You must have seen somebody else, because I'm not a mighty warrior. And then he says this, Gideon replied, "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" I mean, Gideon's not exactly brimming with confidence here. In fact, he says, if God is with us, then why this? You ever ask that question? God, if you're with me, if you're for me, if you're on my side, then why all of this? Why am I struggling here? Why do I have this battle over here? Why did this happen? Why did I get let go from that place? Why do I have this sickness? God, if you're with me, why this? Why all this struggle? God, you've done so much for others. What about me? What about my family? What about my needs? And how does God respond to that? It's kind of interesting, because he doesn't even answer that question. Verse 14 says, "The Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?'" It's amazing, isn't it? Well, it's amazing it happened to somebody else. I mean, if that happened to me, I'd be like, I don't know about that. He says, "Go in the strength that you have." And Gideon is probably thinking, I don't have any strength. I don't have very much. And God's like, exactly. Go in the strength that you have. We'll see what happens. Go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? So God has a question for Gideon. Am I not sending you? I've got a job for you. I've got a mission for you. I've got something I want for you to accomplish. And notice Gideon gives another, "Pardon me. Pardon me, God. I think you've got the wrong person. Pardon me, Lord." Gideon replied, "But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family." So Gideon reaches into his bag of excuses, and he pulls out a weak excuse, right? Literally, he pulls out a weak excuse. I can't do it. I'm too weak. I can't do it. My family's too weak. I can't do it. We're all weak. You ever tried that with God? God, you've got the wrong person. God, in fact, let me help you out. I'll find some other people that can do what you've called me to do. I tried that. God, you've got the wrong person. I can't. And then you reach into your bag for your weak excuse. I can't. I'm too young. I can't. I'm too old. I can't. I'm too inexperienced. I can't. I'm too poor. I can't. I'm too busy. By the way, that's one God loves. I'm too busy. Well, I can fix that for you. I can slow you down. Remember that job that is taking up all your time? I can take care of that. I can't. I'm too messed up. My past is just too overwhelming. I can't. I'm not smart enough. I can't. I'm not popular enough. I can't, God. I'm not good enough. To God, those are all weak excuses. But you're in luck, because God chooses to use those who are weak. Am I not sending you? God chooses to use those who are weak. In fact, 1 Corinthians 1:26, Paul tells us this. He says, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. I mean, we're looking at Gideon's calling, okay? So let's look at us. Paul says, think about what you were when you were called, when God saved you, when God said, listen, I've got something I want you to do. Think of what you were when God called you. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Thanks, Paul. Not many of you were influential. Not many of you were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things. Thanks, Paul. Don't you love how he says it? Think about you guys. God chose fools. Like, wait, he's talking about me, isn't he? I'm not that smart, but come on. Even I picked up on that one. He chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not. Fill in the blank. I'm not good. I'm not smart. I'm not whatever. Yeah. In case I missed it, God chose the not to nullify the things that are. Paul's got away with words, doesn't he? Why? So that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, that you've been called, that you've been set apart, who has become for us the wisdom of God. That is our righteousness, our holiness, and redemption. Those are all things that happened when we were set apart, when God called us. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. See, God chooses those who are weak. So if you're thinking to yourself, I'm too weak to do whatever God's called me to do, exactly. That's the point. Go in the strength that you have. And when Gideon told God how weak he was and how weak his entire family tree was, God reminds him, Gideon, listen. I'm going to be with you. We're going to do this together. And the rest of Judges 6 is Gideon wanting to know for sure, God, are you sure that you're going to be with me? Are you sure that you're going to be with me? In fact, 3 times he asked for a sign. 2 of those times he puts out a fleece and he says, okay, God, if you're going to be with me, if you're going to use me to save Israel, make the fleece wet and everything else around it dry. And then he reverses, okay, well, you did that. Okay, well, maybe that was just a fluke. This time I make the fleece dry and everything else around it wet. Let's just change it up a bit. And both times God honors that request. By the way, as a side note, God doesn't always honor that request. He can, but he doesn't always operate that way. We can't put him in the box that way. But in this instance, God honored that request. In fact, we're not going to read the rest of Judges 6 today, but that would be a great homework assignment for you guys this week. Read Judges chapter 6 this week. For right now, let's see how the story unfolds in Judges 7.
Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, there's still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home.
All right. That's amazing, isn't it? Once again, it's amazing because God told somebody else to do it. You know, I've heard people talk about this passage, and I've heard some people say, God sifted them out, and he for some of them, he wanted to see how they drank, and if they bring the water up to their mouth, they're going to be the ones that are more alert, so we want to keep those ones, and we're going to send everybody else away. When I first heard that, I'm like, that just sounds ridiculous, because I don't think God is into military strategy. Have you read any of his battle plans? None of them seem to make sense. That's just my take on it. So here's lesson number 2. Lesson number 2 is this, and I think this is huge, that God's strength is amplified in our weakness. God's strength is amplified. It's turned up. It's boosted in our weakness. God says, you have too many men. That's something, a military general never said. You know what our problem is? We've got too good of an army. We've got way too many people to be fighting the enemy right now. We are just too overpowerful. You've never had a sports team that has said that. They've thought it before. Our problem is everybody on our team is just so awesome that we wipe everybody out. God says, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. See, God's strength is amplified in our weakness. See, God wanted to leave no doubt as to who was the source of their victory. He wanted to leave no doubt who gets the credit for their deliverance. So not only does God choose a weak warrior like Gideon, but then he takes a weak, outnumbered army of 32,000 men and he trims it down to 10,000 weaker soldiers. He says, if you don't want to fight, if you're afraid, just go home. And 2/3 of them, they just leave right away. And that's still too many. He trims it down even further to 300. Less than 1% of his original army is now gone. It's incredible. So what are the odds? The odds are this, that the Midianite army is so huge, so large, they can't even be counted. In fact, verse 12 of chapter 7 says they're thick as locusts. Their camels could be no more counted than the sand of the seashore. The odds are it's 300 versus an innumerable army. The odds certainly aren't stacked in Gideon's favor. And, one of the things that I find interesting about this passage is when you read Judges chapter 6, Gideon wants to know for sure, God, are you going to be with me? God, are you going to be with me? Are you going to be with me? Are you going to be with me? And he kind of tests God to make sure, God, are you with me? Give me a sign. Are you with me? And then in Judges chapter 7, God turns the tables. He says, hey, remember that little test? I'm going to turn that around. And I'm going to test you this time. Gideon, are you still with me? God, or Gideon, are you still with me? Gideon, do you trust me? Do you trust me? I wonder if God does that with us. When we start to place our confidence in our own strength, in our own abilities, in our stuff, in our health, in our money, in our brains, in our success, in ourselves, whatever it is, I wonder if God says, listen, you're beginning to rely a little bit too much on your own strength. And I've got way too much to do for you to be relying on your own strength. The Bible tells us that pride goes before the fall. And when we begin to rely on our own ability and not on God, we can be sure that disaster is right around the corner. God's strength is amplified. It's not turned down, it's turned up. It's amplified in our weakness. And so if you're thinking, man, I'm a pretty weak person, that's awesome. That means that God can amplify that. And he can make his strength so much more obvious. I think this is a huge lesson for us. In fact, 2 Corinthians 12:9 says that God's power is made perfect in our weakness, right? It's amplified. I heard this phrase at a conference a while back, so you know it's good, right? Because I wrote it down. I don't know who said it, but I wrote it down. It's like, oh, that's good. They were talking about this passage, and this guy said, sometimes God turns our strengths down so God's glory can get turned up. That's so true, isn't it? Sometimes God turns our strengths down so God's glory can get turned up. When God does something awesome, He does something amazing through weak, ordinary people like you and I, there can be no doubt who deserves the credit. Right? Could it be that once in a while in our lives that God wants to know, are you still with me? Do you still trust me? Or are you relying on your own strength to get through life? The reality is we want to be mighty warriors. I mean, nobody says, if there's a line between weak warriors and mighty warriors, let me sign up to be a weak warrior. I mean, there's no sign up for that. We want to be mighty warriors. We want that to be true of us. We don't want to be failures. We don't want to be victims. We want to be overcomers, right? We want to be mighty warriors, but we don't want to face the challenges, the difficult challenges where God prunes away the things in our lives that prevent us from relying on His provision. And that's exactly what God did with Gideon in the army. He says, listen, I'm going to prune some things away so that you'll know that it's me that brings deliverance, so that you won't get overconfident in your own abilities. That's what God was doing with Gideon in the nation of Israel, and I believe He does that with us as well. Let's see what happens next with Gideon, verse 8.
So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israelite and called out, "Get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands."
That's amazing, isn't it? I don't know. He's just reading that, and I'm like, man, how big was that loaf of bread? That is a powerful loaf of bread. It's not like Mom used to make, right? That's pretty amazing. Isn't it interesting that it says that he showed up just when that story was being told? Just at the right time, he shows up, and here's the first story he hears. That's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. Here's the third lesson I want us to learn is this, that God encourages us in our weaknesses. God encourages us in our weakness. God says, listen, if you're still afraid, go down and listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you're going to be encouraged. By the way, do you think that God knows that Gideon is still a little bit afraid? I think that there's still a little bit of fear going on. If you're still afraid, go down and listen to what they're saying. That's pretty amazing. God knows that Gideon has this history of fear, and apparently Gideon is still afraid because he goes. He checks it out. He wants to know, hey, what's the word on the street? What are they saying? And what Gideon discovers is that even the enemy recognizes that God is with Gideon. Talk about some encouraging news. He was encouraged by that, right? And I love Gideon's response. Right then and there. Before he even returned to camp, it says that he bowed down and worshiped. I don't know if he had a guitar. I don't know what song he sang. But, he certainly bowed down and worshiped. And that's pretty amazing because that is the appropriate response. We say that our definition of worship is my response to God for who He is and what He does. And when Gideon found out this incredible news, he was encouraged and he recognized God is with me. I am so encouraged by this. Listen, knowing that God is with you is reason to worship. And it doesn't have to happen here, in this building. Wherever you go, God is with you, and it gives you reason to worship, recognizing that you're in the presence of God. We worship when we recognize that God is in our presence. I mean, that's just something for us to think about. You know, when we're going through difficult times, when things don't seem to be working out the way that we planned it. God, are you with me? God, yes, you are with me. You've promised that you're never going to leave me. You're with me right now. Even in this crummy situation, should cause us to worship. We should be caused to be encouraged. You know, I get the feeling that it was in that moment that Gideon's fear turned into courage. He was encouraged. And that's exactly what God said would happen. He says, listen, if you're afraid, you'll be encouraged. If you're afraid, you'll be encouraged. I will turn your fear into courage. That's exactly what happened. You think about your life. Is that something that you need to happen? You ever struggle with fear and you're like, I'm just not sure. Perhaps even now. Are you lacking courage to do something? Maybe you're gripped by the fear of the unknown. God encourages us in our weakness. And He does so by reminding us of His presence. That's how we're encouraged. Like, you know what? Yeah, this is a terrible situation, but God is with me. Even Gideon's enemies recognized that God was with Gideon. Let's see how the story concludes, verses 16 through 25.
Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Watch me, he told them. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah towards Zerara, as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan, ahead of them as far as Beth Barah." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of Jordan as far as Beth Barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan.
Great job. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks.
Appreciate your hard work on that. Jay's actually going to read that same story to the Treehouse kids right now. They're especially that last line about their heads, bringing those nightmares. Just kidding. Jeff Szymanski's going to do it. There's some great lessons in that section as well, right? One of the kind of funnier immediate lessons is it's not always a good thing to have a place named after you. I'm reading through that, it's like, ooh. So if somebody comes up and says, "Hey, I want to name a laundromat after you," I'm like, "No thanks." That could be the way I get murdered. Anyway, so here's the bigger lesson. And I think this is amazing as well. That God equips the weak for great things. God equips the weak for great things. You know, as I was reading through this and I was kind of like putting the outline together, I kind of got stumped on this last section. You know, I tried to take the passage and look in these different sections. I'm like, you know, so what is there something that stands out about weakness in this particular section? And I'm like, and finally it dawned on me. I'm like, this is amazing, really, when you think about it. I mean, they have this weak leader, this reluctant leader, Gideon. He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't have very, very good confidence in himself, right? He's like, you've got the wrong guy. He's a weak leader. And then they have this weak army where God prunes it down from 32,000 down to 300 men. And then now they've got some pretty weak equipment to work with, right? Think about it. Do you happen to notice what they're carrying into battle? Verse 16 says he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of them all with torches inside. Verse 20 says the three companies blew the trumpets and they smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets. And in their third hand they had a sword. It doesn't say that. They didn't have a third hand. Some of you are like, wait, they had a third hand? Wow, that's miraculous. What translation is that? You know. What do they have in their hands? Trumpets, jars, torches. That's it. I mean, could they have had more with them? You know, perhaps. I don't know. They weren't using those things to fight with, at least not initially. They had both hands occupied. I think that's pretty amazing. What about the sword? What about the spear? If that were me, I'd be like, you know, oh, okay, God, well, see, I've got a trumpet. Check. I've got a torch. Check. And I've got a jar that I'm pretty sure I'm going to break. That's all I got. This is what you've equipped me with. That's it. I don't have the right equipment for all this. And God's like, I know, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be great. It's going to be my favorite part of the story. It's going to be awesome because you're not going to have all of this stuff that you think that you need. It's going to be awesome. Wait till you see what I do with that. Wait till you see what I do with that jar and that trumpet and that torch. Wait till you see what I do with a sling and a stone and a teenage shepherd boy named David. Wait till you see what I do with the jawbone of a donkey and a guy named Samson. Wait till you see what I do with a kid and 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. Wait till you see what I do with a guy named Peter who's always speaking before he thinks. Wait till you see what I do with a guy named Paul who hates Christians until he becomes one. Wait till you see what I do with a group of Christ followers in a tiny town called Obi, New York. Wait till you see how I equip them for the mission that I've called them to. Wait till you see it. It's going to be great. Now, some of them, they're going to struggle with insecurity, God says. Some of them are going to struggle with fear. Some of them are going to be overwhelmed by the baggage of their past. Some of them are just going to feel overwhelmed. Some of them are going to have physical challenges. Some of them are going to think they're too weak for battle. But I see them as mighty warriors, even when they don't see that themselves. And I've equipped them with everything that they need because all they really need is me. That's it. It's amazing, isn't it? All we really need is God. You know, it doesn't matter what the odds are. It doesn't matter if they're stacked against you. I'll probably say this later on in this series too. But it doesn't matter what the odds are because you plus God is always the majority. Because the reality is that God is always the majority. And He just lets you tag along. And He gives you some responsibilities. Like we mentioned last week, sometimes God says, listen, I've won the battle. It's already taken care of. Now I want you to march 20 miles uphill. You're going to have a part to play, and it's going to be hard, but I've already won the battle. You still have some responsibilities, but you're going to win it. It's amazing. And God equips us for that task. So what do we do? What's our battle plan? What do we do with what we've just heard? On the back of your notes, I've given you some questions that kind of relate to these 4 different lessons. So there's kind of one question for each lesson. Lesson number 1 is that God chooses to use those who are weak. So the question is, what weak excuses have you been giving God for not serving Him completely? Do you have any weak excuses? You know, God, I'd love to serve, but I'm too old. I'm too young. I'm not smart enough. I'm not rich enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not good enough. You've got the wrong person. God, I would, but I'm just, you fill in the blank. What excuses have you been given God? God looks at him and says, that's a weak excuse. And I've heard them all. Even when we give God our weak excuses, he still chooses to use us because God chooses to use the weak. He chooses to use those who are weak. Lesson number 2 was this, that God's strength is amplified in our weakness. So here's your second question. Where are you relying on your own strength to get things done rather than taking a risk doing something beyond your own strength? See, it's not a risky move to do something that you're perfectly capable of doing on your own. That's not a risk at all. But to do something that goes beyond your strength, that goes beyond what you can pull off on your own, God says, wow, I'm honored in that. I'll get behind that because you can't do it on your own. You can't even take credit for all that. I'll help you with that. In fact, the Bible tells us that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. When we're like, I can't do this, God's like, finally, I can get involved. What are some of those things that God may need to prune out of your life because they're getting in the way of God getting all of the credit? Sometimes God turns our strengths down so God's glory can get turned up. Lesson number 4 was this, that God encourages us in our weakness. So here's the question. Where are you lacking courage because of the fear of the unknown? Where are you lacking courage because of the fear of the unknown? Is it an upcoming medical procedure? Is it an unpaid bill? Is it what the future holds for your job? Is it the upcoming election? I'm sure nobody's concerned about that. So we'll move right along. Is it a relational struggle? Is it something else? Is it a tough conversation that you know that you've got to have, but I just don't know how it's going to go? Listen, when you lack courage, remind yourself of God's presence in your life and in your circumstances, because God's presence encourages us in our weakness. Number 4, God equips the weak for great things. So here's the question. What are some ways that God has equipped you to do great things for God? Not great things for yourself. See, that's the opposite of what the story teaches. What are some things, some ways that God has equipped you to do great things for God? Now remember, God can use absolutely anything. If he can use jars, trumpets, and torches, and all of these other useless things, in some regards, at least as it relates to battle, how can God use you? What are some of those things? Not just your strengths, but your weaknesses, your painful experiences, your bad choices. What are some of those things that God can use about you that you would have thought, that's like one of my greatest weaknesses? And God says, listen, I can turn that up. I can amplify myself if you just submit that to me. See, when God called Gideon to save his people, the angel of the Lord looked at Gideon and called him mighty warrior. Was Gideon a mighty warrior at the time? I would have to say, not yet. But God looked at who he would become and not just who he was. He looked beyond his past. He looked beyond his family. He looked beyond his present circumstances. He looked beyond the innumerable army of Midian. And God looked into Gideon's future and said, you're the guy I'm going to use because you're the least likely candidate to be used. You know that God looks at you the same way. He looks at me the same way. He looks at us and says, listen, you may see yourself as a weak warrior, but God sees you and I as mighty warriors. We all struggle with fear. We struggle with the fear of failure, the fear of the unknown, the fear of our enemies, the fear of the odds that are stacked against us. But when God looks at us, he says, listen, you don't need to be afraid. Be encouraged. Replace your fear with courage. Why? Because I will be with you, and I am with you. And as we've been saying throughout this series, that God is not only with us, he is for us. And if God is for us, who can be against us? Right? I hope you're encouraged. Would you stand and join me in prayer?